So, Mike, there is nothing worse in my mind than reconnecting with my graduating class. I honestly couldn't care less what most of the people, almost all of them, are doing right now. But
Yeah, I recognize that feeling.
glad it's not just me. But there used to be a social network, one of the very early ones that you're going to tell us a bit about today, that actually was designed for that very purpose. So Classmates was a kind of 90s network, and we've gone back through the archives, dusted off some of the marketing material, and we found that Classmates used to kind of sell the idea of its network by saying that every yearbook was a window into the past, which sounds like a kind of reason to not use the platform, to be honest.
It's poetic.
So let's use that as our starting point for Ctrl-Alt-Speech today. What yearbook would you most like to look through the window of, or not, frankly?
Yeah, there's probably a few that I would not want to revisit ever when you phrase it that way. But no, what I was going to say is that I do think that in the world of tech, it often feels that we are so focused on like the now and then the future, right? That is the nature of tech. Innovation is always changing, and everyone is either trying to explain what is happening now or looking towards the future. What is this all going to mean? And because of that, we very rarely actually look at the past and an understanding of how did we get here. And I actually think that's really important because many of the discussions that we have about today and the future, if you don't understand the past and how we got here, that's really problematic. And hopefully today we're going to do a little bit of looking backwards through that window into the past. What about you? What year are you looking at?
Well, I'm primarily interested in 2003 onwards, not because that was when, I just about started secondary school and was straightening my hair and generally being very emo, but that's the kind of point at which I think the relationship between media organizations and platforms started to get really interesting. And so hopefully we're going to use that as a point in time to go back and revisit some of those dynamics in ways that I think is important for not only where we are now, but where we're going in the future. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. This episode is coming out on the 5th of March, 2026, but due to some scheduling gymnastics, this is actually a pre-recorded edition of Ctrl-Alt-Speech, timed for the upcoming release of an exciting new book that we're going to be talking about today. My name is Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything in Moderation, and I've dragged Mike Basnick, founder and editor of TechDirt, back into the virtual Ctrl-Alt-Speech studio, where he's been AWOL for some time. Mike, listeners are going to have forgotten what you sound like.
I know. I've been gone. I'm constantly traveling. And I was going to say, since this is a pre-recorded episode and we are focused on the past, this is us coming from the past to March 5th. Yeah. Hopefully nothing crazy happens between us recording this and when this episode comes out. But yeah, no, I've been constantly on the road traveling pretty much nonstop, which has been a little bit tiring. And as we're recording this, I still have more travel coming up. Literally very, very soon, I have to get on an airplane. So,
are you leaving shortly? Is it that? Are you going today?
It's tomorrow morning.
Okay.
But I need to pack as soon as we're done with this.
The unglamorous realities of being a podcast host, eh? You don't even have somebody who can pack for you. That's terrible.
Yeah, right.
Well, I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad we managed to pen you down for this conversation because you and TechDirt have been around for the whole of the kind of eras we're going to talk about today. You've really charted the dynamics of platforms and been one of the media, I think, that has been a kind of cornerstone of some of what we've seen, which is important that you're here. This is why we've done it at such a time where you can participate between flights. So yeah, just to give you a bit of background to listeners, this book that we're going to talk about today is a book called Trust, Safety, and the Internet We Share. It's an academic book of sorts. It's being published by Routledge in the coming months, and it's bringing together a lot of really interesting insights from people who worked in trust and safety who are charting how the kind of internet has evolved over time and how trust and safety decisions have been made. And I think it's been pulled together by the Trust and Safety Foundation, which is the kind of foundation arm of the TSPA, the Trust and Safety Professional Association, which is a industry body that has been kind of created to bring together people who work in trust and safety. They run the famous TrustCon, which we met at and which we go back to every year and do our live episode. So there's been a kind of effort by the TSPA and the Trust and Safety Foundation to, in this moment, I guess, with everything that's going on and the chaos that's happening in internet safety, to kind of mark this moment and capture some stories and narratives and encapsulate, I guess, what's been going on in the last 20, 25 years of the internet. And so the book is, from the bits I've read as I've been part of the process, it's a really great encapsulation of all of that.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk a bit more about that today.
It really looks wonderful. I mean, just looking, you can look through the table of contents on the website about it, and everything that's going to be in there. There'll be, if you work at all in trust and safety, there should be a whole bunch of really familiar names, including one of the co-hosts of this podcast, which is you, Ben, contributed a chapter to this particular book. And I think that is what we're going to explore today. I think the idea is that we're going to have a discussion specifically about your chapter because I found it absolutely fascinating. But again, it's a big book. I saw somewhere it said how many pages they're expecting. 368 pages. This is, you put this on your coffee table. You show off this book. This is not something you hide somewhere else, right? This is a big, weighty book. But it looks like it's really going to be fantastic. But we wanted to talk today about the particular chapter that you contributed, which is specifically about the 3 eras of content moderation in the media and then what comes next. And as you noted in the intro, you start this paper in around 2003. And there's but also, as we talked about, right, there were sort of proto social media before that. And there's an interesting aspect to this that I've been trying to think about, which is how I think everyone sort of judges the evolution of the internet from the sort of era where they got onto the internet, right?
Yeah.
And or even like you look back a little bit, right? Because so like I really got on the internet for the first time in 1993.
Wow.
And yeah, because I'm old. But at that time when I got on, I thought I had missed all the excitement of the internet of the late 80s and early 90s. I was late to the party and worried about missing stuff. And note that I got on the internet before the World Wide Web was really there and existed. And in fact, I remember a year or two after I first got on the internet, I had met a bunch of people through the internet, through IRC and Usenet, which were sort of 2 of the early communications protocols. I met some people who were at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which happened to also be where Mark Andreessen was and where he created the first graphical web browser, which was Mosaic. And so they were telling me, hey, there's this project that people that we work with are working on.
Wow.
And Mark was not a part of the group of folks that I was talking to, but these other people were, some of whom I'm actually still friends with now, many years later. And I set up to download the original Mosaic.
Whoa.
Soon after it first came out based on that. And that was like beginning to get into the World Wide Web.
You know that what this kind of reminds me of? It's like, it reminds me of how you could have stopped Voldemort. It feels like you had, it feels like how Harry could have prevented Voldemort from kind of becoming an evil being. Like, it feels like you had the chance to make that stop, Mike, and you missed the opportunity, or like the kind of timings didn't kind of line up, and now we have kind of Mark Andreessen 2026
as Voldemort, as he who shall not be named.
As he, quite right.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, but I mean, it's interesting. It is interesting to me to like look at the past through, and this even comes up with all the stuff. Because I just did another interview on a different podcast about the whole like decentralization stuff that obviously I've been focused on, the protocols, not platforms paper, and how much of that actually came out of my early experiences with the internet and Usenet and IRC and these things that were protocol based before these sort of more centralized services came up. And it is interesting to me, and I wonder how much our brains anchor in like the internet that you first joined as being, that's the real internet.
Yeah.
And everything after that is a distortion.
Yeah. I probably am guilty of that. But I think the nature of the platforms that kind of arose in the early 2010s, that does kind of constitute the internet for a lot of people now, right?
Yeah.
And they've
absolutely.
spawned to such a kind of degree that it's almost impossible not to think of them as cornerstones of the internet.
I actually think that's exactly right. And that is really important, where the internet that I grew up with was mostly small companies and everything was constantly changing. And I think that started to change right around where you start this paper in 2003. And just as an example of this, I will say, I talked about IRC and Usenet, which were two of the protocols that I used when I first got online. A third one that I used was Gopher. And I don't know if you're familiar with Gopher at all,
No.
but Gopher was sort of an earlier kind of web-like protocol, but it was basically all text. So I remember I would log into a Gopher server, like you would sort of like a URL, but you would log into a server and there would be different things that you could get on that server. So I would log into a news server and a weather server and get, the news and weather. It was all text-based at the time. And when the web came along, I saw it as, okay, this is an obvious progression from Gopher, which was text-based. And then when I downloaded Mosaic, I suddenly had graphical stuff. And I just figured that, okay, this is the nature of the internet. We start with Gopher, and then we'll have the World Wide Web. That'll last a few years, and then the next thing will come along, and the web will fade away, just like Gopher will fade away. And then the next thing will come along. And so in my head, I sort of like was expecting that sort of progression, like we're always going to get like the new thing. And instead, starting somewhere in the 2000s, as you sort of detail a little bit in the paper, suddenly you had these big giant internet companies that took over, and it wasn't, the nature of the innovation changed. And so for most people, certainly people who are younger than me now, that is the internet, for better or for worse. And I think some of what you describe is getting into that. So let's jump into your paper here and talk about like why did you decide? Well, why did you decide to write it? I guess frame it this way.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I am interested in the way that media and platforms interrelate and how they've worked together and increasingly kind of work against each other. I think that's because I started my career in a big newsroom. I worked in the Times of London. I have to say that for our US listeners. And one of my jobs was actually to liaise with Facebook, X, Twitter as was, and YouTube about how we as a newsroom could utilize these kind of emerging tools. And so an example of what I did was give a list of journalists who should be verified on Twitter. So before kind of just as verification was being launched, we got an outreach from the company, and they said, we want to verify journalists. Who would you like to be verified? And so there was this clamor in the newsroom to have this verification. It was supposedly you had to have your Times email address on your Twitter account as part of the verification process. So there was kind of some manual work being done by everyone in the newsroom to kind of change the email addresses that they set up their Twitter account with to a Times email address. Some people actually created Twitter accounts because they wanted to be verified, weirdly. So they weren't on the platform, but they wanted the status. And that was like one of a number of different kind of, I guess, ways that the newsroom that I worked in tried to work with platforms to spread the journalism that we were producing, to find new audiences. And that was really the ethos in that first era, I would say, that started in kind of 2003. And the idea was that newsrooms could gain a lot from being on these platforms, that they could find new audiences, that they could spread their journalism in ways that wasn't possible before. And there was this kind of excitement and potentially a bit of naivety about that. But there was lots of ways that it kind of it manifested itself. There was the verification, but there was also instant articles. I don't know if you remember that, where Facebook would pull content created by platforms that were partners with the goal of trying to surface that journalism to a wider group of people, whilst also serving the platform's goals of engaging people in the newsfeed. There was the famous pivot to video, which everyone
the infamous,
still refers to. Yeah.
The infamous pivot to
people,
video, yes.
People still have the scars of that, where, again, news organizations were incentivized to create video that would keep users engaged on the platforms, but would also, serve the purpose of kind of monetizing the journalism that the kind of news organizations were creating. And there's all these different ways that the platforms sought to ingratiate themselves with traditional legacy news media. And I think tried to kind of capitalize off the back of the brand and the heritage of a lot of these big companies. There was a legitimacy that comes from having journalists on the platform. The journalists tended to use the platforms a lot. You'll know this very well, but, journalists used it for sourcing. They used it for sharing content. That's what made Twitter at the time the place to go for news. It was the town square was in part because journalists were there, and they attracted a lot of users who potentially wouldn't have otherwise been on the platforms. So that kind of relationship really got me interested, because I saw it firsthand, and I saw that it wasn't always equitable or even. And, it obviously changed subsequently, which we can talk about. But when you think back to that time, like, how do you characterize it? What was kind of TechDirt's role in that phase, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And part of what I try and break apart too is I think that, I was talking a little bit about the sort of pre-2003 era. And I do think that there is an element of that matters to this discussion too, which was not so much the classmates.com or the early social media things or Usenet or whatever, but actually the rise of blogs, I think, predates a bunch of this stuff, right? And TechDirt started before the word blog even existed. And actually there was a period of time where people would refer to it as the TechDirt blog, and I would resist that and say, no, we're not a blog. Blog is those other things that other people do.
Yeah.
And so there was this period of time where suddenly people discovered that you could publish yourself in some way, right? In the early days, there was, a few early versions of blogging software, and Blogger being probably the biggest one at the time. And then there were a few others that showed up. And so suddenly you had these independent voices. And I think that there was discussion about that, but that really took off post 9/11, when you had suddenly this rise of political bloggers that the mainstream media actually started to pay attention to. And a lot of them got absorbed into the mainstream media. So, the Washington Post and the New York Times sort of picked off these different bloggers. And so there was this element of the legitimization of the internet as a medium for publishing. But still at that time, even the act of blogging was somewhat tricky. You had to set it up, you had to get a server somewhere, and you had to do all these things. And even as some of the services made it easier, there was a lot of work involved. And I think where social media kind of stepped into the fray was they made it super, super easy to express yourself in some form or another, though you were doing it on somebody else's system. And then they added in this one simple element that the blogging revolution had mostly missed, which was the concept of the follower, right? And connecting a feed and a follower and all of this kind of stuff together so that you had a more their audience. In the blog era, we had RSS feeds, and those still exist, and they're still important, they're still useful, and I still make use of them. But it was a different sort of thing. There was a really interesting, I think mostly forgotten company that had this terrible name called My Blog Log. And it basically tried to create a social media element to blogs, in that it allowed you to create blogs you followed, and it created follower lists, and it added that sort of social graph element to blogs. I don't even remember what happened to them. I think maybe they got sold at some point, but they disappeared. But there were all these elements, and it really came together with Twitter in particular. And obviously Facebook much larger, but Facebook initially, they didn't have the news feed concept, and Twitter sort of, I think, really got across, especially to the media, this idea that news happens there. And my own story of where Twitter hit for me, I think was really important to me. I got on Twitter in 2007, and I didn't fully get it at first. And I sort of played around with it, and I was like, I don't know. I don't quite see the point. My first two tweets were something silly. And I think the second one was basically yeah, I don't get this. which is interesting in retrospect. But I remember in January of 2008, the thing that convinced me that Twitter was, two things convinced me that Twitter was fascinating. One was that I was traveling. I was actually over in your fair country, and I went on Twitter, and I just got into this random conversation with someone who I didn't even really kind of know. I sort of, knew through Twitter, but I didn't know him well or something. We were talking, and it turned out that like we both really liked this very small but really good restaurant in New York City that I'm a huge fan of. And somehow that came out in a conversation. And I remember I was in the UK, and I mentioned like, oh, I'm going to be in New York in 2 weeks. And he was like, well, let's meet for lunch at this place. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. Like making this connection. We actually did meet for lunch, and it was a very nice lunch. But then that same month, January of 2008, was the beginning of the 2008 presidential election in the US. And the beginning of the presidential election process is the Iowa caucuses. And I was trying to find out what was going on with the Iowa caucuses. Again, these are things that are lost to history. But at the time, Hillary Clinton was basically considered the leading candidate. And probably the second candidate that people were talking about was John Edwards. And the third candidate was this upstart Barack Obama. People didn't really think he could win. So I was like, I opened up CNN, and CNN was giving these like, exit poll interview kinds of things from the caucus. The caucus process is really weird because it's not voting. It's like this group agreement process. It's not worth getting into. But CNN was reporting like, oh, it's a dead heat. Hillary is probably going to win, but it's really a dead heat between Hillary and John Edwards, and this Barack Obama guy is getting some notice or whatever. So I had that on CNN, and then I went on Twitter, and somebody had set up, this is like before there were retweets or whatever, and before there were like lists and feeds. I don't know how this person did it, whatever, but they just said like, basically, we're just going to like repost or highlight everything from people talking about Iowa caucuses. So I just started following that feed, and it was people in the rooms, in the caucus rooms, over and over again saying, Barack Obama is winning. Like, everybody loves him. Barack Obama is winning. They're winning. He's winning. He's winning. He's winning. And like, so I'm watching CNN say, Hillary's probably going to win. Dead heat. It's not really clear. And then Twitter, people like in the rooms saying, people love this Obama guy.
Wow.
And then you watch across the night, and it was like later in the night where CNN finally was like, oh, actually, it looks like Obama is actually going to win the Iowa caucuses, which we didn't. It was a surprise.
Right.
And like, that was the moment where I was like, oh, wait, this is powerful, more powerful than CNN, which was like the top of the heap in terms of like powerful media at the time.
Yeah.
Where I was like, oh, there's news here. Like,
yeah,
there's real news here.
Yeah. That for me was really interesting, because then you saw news media then try to hop on the back of this phenomenon, right? And there's a really interesting, when I was kind of leaving university in 2010, around that time, I'd just done a kind of master's in journalism. I don't know why that was. It was a stupid idea, particularly because it was newspaper journalism. Who the hell is doing a newspaper journalism master's in 2010? Like, come on. But the people who were really interesting were these journalists who were texting from the ground via text message.
Yep.
But sending those out via Twitter. That was kind of before many people had smartphones, or before they were ubiquitous. And there's some guys from Sky and The Guardian and NPR and Reuters, and they were doing some really cool kind of experiments on breaking news and building really large followings. Like we see similar things now. It's a kind of playbook for creating a large social media following. Yeah. It's almost like a kind of 10-step process. People sell you a PDF for $50 to do it.
Yeah, that's right.
But back in the day, like it was very, very new. And I was having conversations in my newsroom that was like, why should I be on Twitter? I write for one of the foremost newspapers in the UK, gets sent to all corners of the globe. Like, I don't need to be spending time on my phone or texting or whatever it is you're telling me to do. Stupid upstart graduate as I was. So there was a kind of really interesting dynamic there playing out in the newsroom, was like people wanted to be using these tools in one hand to kind of reach new audiences, and at the same time a whole bunch of people were saying this is pointless. And then in the background, I don't know if you remember, Rupert Murdoch tried to buy
Yes.
MySpace.
Yeah.
Right?
He did buy MySpace.
He did buy MySpace. Yeah. I mean,
and a bunch of other internet properties too. There was this period of time where he had like a pretty large internet empire that I should dig it out on TechTurd. I have an article where at one point where I was like, it actually seemed like he had a real strategy around the time that he bought MySpace. And I had written something that was kind of like, this is surprising, but it felt like, because other people were trying to build internet empires, but they were all doing a really bad job of it and just like screwing it up. Whereas initially, this changed pretty quickly, but initially it did look like Murdoch had a very like internet savvy approach to building out internet services, and buying MySpace was part of that.
Yeah. And I think in this time as well, if we think about the way that platforms did content moderation, the focus from a platform's point of view was on illegal harms.
Yes.
Yeah, right. In the early days, it was terrorist content, CSAM.
Well, I would go back before that even, it was all copyright. I mean, before the terrorist content, I mean, CSAM has always been an issue, but like before the terrorist content issue came up, copyright was the bigger thing. And if you talk to like the old school trust and safety folks, almost all of them started in the like copyright enforcement side of it. Yeah. And that's what you were getting takedowns. You had the DMCA in the US, obviously. And the terrorist stuff actually came later.
Yeah. But when it came to the way that the media thought about platforms, though, they were very happy for platforms just to concentrate on copyright and on terrorist content and CSAM, right? Because the idea of hate speech was not a firmly understood thing. A lot of the publishers probably spouted a lot of hate speech themselves, but they were kind of happy to let the platforms do their thing because they were gaining from it in terms of eyeballs and reach. And then I think everything kind of changed around 2016. I think that's when
what happened in 2016, Ben?
Everything went to pot. Everything disintegrated.
Well, as American baseball fans know, that's the year that the Cubs finally broke their curse and won the World Series after nearly 100 years. And I think that fractured the rest of the universe.
That was like a kind of a chasm in the kind of in the ecosystem. Everything kind of shifted as a result of that.
I think there's a very strong argument that the Chicago Cubs are to blame for everything and not social media. But that's a separate discussion.
Yeah. I mean, as well as the Cubs, you had Brexit, you had Donald Trump's election.
Yes.
There was the kind of Cambridge Analytica scandal that emerged in the kind of years afterwards. And I think that started to awaken media organizations to the power of these platforms. And I kind of argue in the paper that the fascination of the first, let's say, 10 or 15 years kind of turned into fury. All of a sudden, you had publishers who were pushing platforms to focus on misinformation and hate speech, not just those illegal harms that characterized the first period. They saw not only that the platforms were kind of acting irresponsibly in their eyes, but they were kind of taking business away from them. They were taking ad revenue in ways that obviously we've seen grow and perpetuate since. And so they kind of turned on the platforms in that time and did a lot of investigations into the way that platforms worked. There was a famous one in the UK at the Times, where I was at the time. An investigation was done into terrorist content appearing next to ads of kind of very large advertisers. And this idea that you didn't have any kind of brand safety as an advertiser on the platform. You didn't know where you were showing up. And so, that was a really potentially damaging problem if you were an advertiser. That led to a big change in the way that brand safety was viewed, and YouTube and other platforms gave a lot more control to advertisers about what they could and couldn't kind of show up against. But there were other investigations into platforms at that time. And I'm thinking about, in the years afterwards, some of the work that Casey Newton did when he was at The Verge, and the work that Jeff Horowitz did for the Wall Street Journal, famously the Facebook files, which fundamentally kind of changed the way we think about Facebook and actually changed the company's name. There was they were all kind of characteristic of media turning on platforms, I think, and using the weapons, using what they have, the ability to investigate institutions and power, to try and address what they saw as, I think, these platforms becoming too powerful.
Yeah, and I think there are a bunch of different stories in there, and I want to go back a little bit before 2016 too, because I think it's an important part of the story is the Arab Spring, which became this big news story. And even, I mean, I sort of mentioned a little bit, but the election of Barack Obama in 2008 was seen as, oh, he embraced social media, and in particular Facebook, and Facebook sort of helped his campaign reach different voters, and so there was this period from like 2008, then the Arab Spring, sort of 2012-ish timeframe, 2010, 11, where people are like, oh, this internet is this powerful force for free speech and democracy that got a lot of attention. And then you mixed into it the fact that, yeah, some of the more traditional media properties began to suddenly realize like, oh, wait, the internet is causing problems for our business. And the blame game would shift. There was this period of time where it was like, oh, it's all Craigslist's fault that the news media is dying. And then it shifted to, oh, it's all Google's fault. And then it shifted to, it's all Facebook's fault. And, there are bits and pieces that I think are maybe accurate, but I think sort of overplayed. And then you're right that you had these big moments of Brexit and Trump being elected a few months separated from one another. And a lot of people, especially in the media, wanted someone to blame for those two things. Mm-hmm. And it was very easy to blame social media for both of those things. And if you looked, it's obviously like Cambridge Analytica stuff, which came out, really the details of that came out a couple of years later, but started to leak out. But you could find people on social media saying obviously false stuff and spreading disinformation. So it was easy to blame, though the actual causal relationship, I don't think was ever really shown. I don't think it could have been shown because I still don't think it had that big of an impact, but that's editorializing on my part. But suddenly, yeah, it really did feel that the media completely shifted. And a lot of that, it's tough to separate, like how much of that was driven by professional jealousy versus actual concern about these things. And there could be elements of both of those at play, but it felt that there was this immediate shift from, oh, the internet is this force for good and free speech, to the internet is this force for disinformation and evil and must be stomped out.
Yeah. And I think my sense from writing the chapter is that there was, that in the kind of first phase, in the phase where media was using platforms to reach new audiences, that was a kind of a pact that they were prepared to make.
Yeah.
But I think that from academia that I've read around it, the idea of basically the kind of structural dependency of the platforms became too great. I think that's kind of what happened, is that they became not something that you kind of experimented on or innovated on or, texted from the ground as a fun way to gain followers and try to kind of reach new people. It actually became a core part of the business of these media organizations. And they kind of, maybe they woke up from the fact that actually not only were they key for their businesses, but they had a massive role in society in a way that they didn't recognize in those early years because they were kind of too busy having fun with it and generating loads of page views. And, a lot of media businesses were built on the back of Facebook traffic.
Yep.
BuzzFeed is the perfect example.
Yeah.
You could almost kind of create a media from scratch, and if you played by Facebook's rules. And there's a reason why all of those types of publishers have died out now, because Facebook and other platforms moved the goalposts. So the rose-tinted spectacles kind of came off, I think, around that time.
Yeah. And I think there were a few elements there. And now I've, for a very long time, have argued that news organizations lost track of what business they were really in. And in particular, that if you look at the history of news organizations, is that they've always been in the business of building community, but they thought that they were in the business of distributing news. And mistaking that led to some really bad situations, one of which you've written about separately, and which we discussed not that long ago, about comment sections, where I always thought that comment sections on news for news orgs was an area where they could build real community and build loyalty. And instead, a lot of news organizations either shut those down or worse, outsource them to Facebook.
Yeah.
And became really reliant on this other platform and really lost control over the one thing that they had that was unique. And then they were so reliant on traffic from Facebook, they had no loyalty. Like you had a Then eventually we get to the algorithmic stage where then you need them to get into the algorithm. I remember I had a conversation in 2015. I'm working backwards to where the conversation was to figure out the year, but it was definitely in 2015. I had a conversation with someone who told me that, well, we've all, is sort of referring to the media, we've all figured out how to get that free 1 million visits from Facebook every month. And I was sitting there thinking, I haven't. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we, for better or for worse, and probably for worse in some situations, but maybe in the long run for better, Techdirt never focused on chasing any of these fads. I do remember when the whole like pivot to video thing happened, I did have a conversation with I spoke to, I can't remember which platform it was. I spoke to one of the platforms where it's like, would you fund us to do video stuff? And it went nowhere. And I was like, okay, it's probably a good thing.
You escaped.
Yeah. Though now everything is coming back around to video. But we never really played that game. And I always focus on like keeping a loyal community. And I always, every year I do a report at the beginning of each year about the previous year, about where traffic comes from. And the thing that is most important to me is how much of it is direct, because that is a sign of loyalty, as opposed to relying on some sort of algorithm or some other sites to send you traffic. But so many other people they outsourced all of the important stuff. They outsourced the community, they outsourced that, and then they lost the loyalty. And so when these companies began to change their focus or their business model, or realize that, they had faked their video numbers or whatever it was, they lost all that and they had nothing else to rely on. And so I think that definitely then contributed to the general dislike that media organizations had for social media. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the world, but it's very easy to just sort of see these two things and say, oh, that must be connected, and therefore we can blame it. That said, like, there was really some bad stuff happening as well. And some of the reporting, you mentioned like Casey Newton at The Verge, and like his original reporting on trust and safety workers, I think was really eye-opening for a lot of people who, even as they were saying like, oh, we want these platforms to clean up, there's bad content that needs to be cleaned up, they didn't realize what that actually means, which is like hiring a bunch of people and exposing them to nonstop terrible content to block it from you. And is that worth it to put people in that position? I think was sort of a real reckoning moment as well.
Yeah. And not only were kind of journalists acting in their traditional role as reporting on and investigating these platforms, but in this period, there's also this kind of interesting role that they played in basically working as unpaid content moderators.
Yes.
This
is a huge point. Yeah.
Yeah, this has really got me interested in the relationship between media and platforms in the first place, because we still see this now.
Yes.
In a story about a platform doing something egregious or leaving up some harm,
right,
the journalist will go to the platform and ask for a comment, and the platform will, having not taken down that content through all of the kind of human or automated means so far, would then take down the content because they've been contacted by the journalist about it. And this still happens. I make a running list of examples when I see this. And it's fascinating, right? Because these platforms have very advanced trust and safety functions. They have, like I say, human and automated systems in place. Like if it gets to the place where a journalist is contacting you about some content, you probably just want to kind of stand by your decision or justify it in some way. Taking it down suggests some sort of, that something has gone wrong. And the guys who've now founded 404 Media, which we refer to a lot on the podcast, Jason Kobler and Joseph Cox, they used to work for Vice, and this used to happen to them a lot. And so there's this kind of secondary role that journalists played in this era.
The moderator of last resort.
Yeah, basically the kind of last line of defense.
I have a slightly different perspective on that, which is like, I do think that like, it's a really it's a good story, but I do question how accurate a story it is. I do think like, yes, journalists find stuff that is bad and then the companies take action. And the question that people always ask is like, well, look, okay, if Joseph Cox can find this terrible stuff, why didn't the company find that terrible stuff? And there is an answer to that, which is like, yes, the company has a large trust and safety team and all these processes, and they're looking for a very large set of really terrible things and trying to deal with it. And they're catching an awful lot of it, which I think, the companies and the trust and safety teams never got enough respect or credit for.
True.
And yes, they're going to miss some of that because you have malicious actors who are trying to get around these systems and are doing all sorts of things. And so, yes, it feels not great that journalists had to call these things out and make the companies take action. But I think that downplays how much effort had already gone into the trust and safety function and how much content they had caught and had pulled down and how much work they were doing. Because it's always easy to say, well, all we did was this search for this one keyword. And it's like, yeah, but there's like 50,000 other keywords that other people are searching on and that they're catching a whole bunch of this stuff. And yes, some stuff gets through because you can't always get all of it. But I do think that it is a really interesting element how much even like trust and safety policy later got driven by reporting. So like if this makes us look bad, suddenly like, okay, now we have to change the policy that we didn't think through all the implications or we play down the implications of this policy.
Yeah. And I did a piece of work a couple of years ago where I interviewed about a dozen trust and safety workers, and they talked consistently amongst all of them about how media played a role in how policies were developed and also then what happened in specific cases. They would share articles that probably you wrote and that others wrote about how they did trust and safety, and it would act as a lever. Sometimes they'd use it to get their bosses to give them more resources.
Absolutely.
Right? It's not a bad thing necessarily. Sometimes they would use it to kind of change the way that they approach a particular harm. So media has always been one of the kind of ways that platforms address how they work. Nowadays, obviously, we have regulation playing a really key role. We've always had advertisers playing a really important role. The rivals of any platform is another factor in that process. But media is almost the kind of fourth pillar in that. And I think the work that was done by a lot of journalists in this time showed that you could shape platforms by alerting not only politicians, but also the general public to the ways that these companies were working internally. And I think that directly, to be honest, Mike, led to a lot of the regulation that we have seen since, right? There's this phase where the kind of media outlets went really hard, going really deep, doing really solid investigative journalism. And that in turn has led to the kinds of, I guess, the number of eyes that are now on these platforms and the regulation that has since emerged. And that's kind of the third phase, the third era, I would say, the Musk era, unfortunately named.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the sort of impact of the sort of, 2016, post-2016 era, where suddenly you went from happy promoting innovation, free speech, whatever, to, oh, wait, there are consequences to all of this, and we need to think through this, to the modern era, which turned into sort of the regulatory era. The thing I'm curious, and I'd love your take on this. So you frame your third era as that sort of regulatory era of 2021 to the present. Do you think, and I know you wrote most of this last year, perhaps early-ish last year, do you think that there's a new era going on in the post-Trump second term where, I mean, you mentioned this in your piece, but like Mark Zuckerberg doing his video basically saying, we got trust and safety wrong. We're going back to this like more laissez-faire, freewheeling, which is nonsense. And we've talked about how it's nonsense. And you have the Elon Musk sort of full mask off kind of thing. I mean, you described this as the mask off era, but I'm sort of wondering if the mask off era really started in 2025 as opposed to 2021. To me, there's an argument that the 2021 to 2024 era is the like, let's just try to regulate stuff. And all these bills come out. A few of them make it through, but not that many. And now the 2025 era becomes the like purely transactional, give me what I want or I'm going to do bad things to you kind of era, which we're seeing sort of on a global stage, not just in the US. In the US, it's just so blatantly explicit. But I think a lot of the regulations that have come about now are like, well, we're going to punish you, do this, or we're going to punish you kind of regulations. Yeah.
I mean, I think certainly in terms of the way that platforms think about the media or think about journalism, I think we're in a kind of continuation of that era. but it's got so much more worse than I could have expected, to be honest. Like, if you think about when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he not only, this is the journalist platform of choice, he got rid of trust and safety. Do you remember he took down the accounts of journalists working for the New York Times?
Yes.
And the Washington Post and CNN and Voice of America?
That's the night that he did that, where he started banning all these journalists, was the night that I turned my account to private and has never come back from that.
Really?
That was the night because I thought he was going after anyone who was mentioning this stuff. And I was like, oh, I'm probably next. And I just switched my account to private. And that was the beginning of the end for me on Twitter.
Yeah. Okay. Never looked back.
Nope.
No. But, he did that. There was a CBS show, 60 Minutes, which did a piece on Donald Trump that featured a source who kind of refuted Trump's idea that the election was interfered with. And Musk called for the people who produced that show to receive a long jail sentence.
Yeah.
He was like anti-media, anti-journalism from the get-go. And I think that allowed other platforms to do similar things. Meta removed a lot of its funding of journalistic and media programs that did a lot of actually quite good work in previous years. They took out, a lot of politics and news content from news feeds, which obviously the famous Mark Zuckerberg video last year actually kind of somewhat readdressed under the guise of civic content, inverted commas. And so that led to a big tanking in Facebook traffic, which saw the demise of some of those traffic-focused news sites, and which a lot of news sites haven't really resolved from. But then, to now have, I guess, the kind of friends of the president being installed in prominent positions of big US media companies, like no one could have really foreseen that, I don't think. And some of the issues that kind of Stephen Colbert has had and some of these other individuals who do really strong journalism, and we've talked about on the podcast, it's almost impossible to have that on the bingo card. It's almost beyond belief.
Yeah. And, it's funny, we started out early on. I talked about like Mark Andreessen, and I think back to an interview that he gave last year, which was, to me, somewhat disconnected from reality, where he discussed that there was this deal that basically if you worked in tech, the media praised you and said really nice things about you and built you up and only said good things and talked about how wonderful all this innovation was. And this was the deal. And then because of that, you got really, really rich. And then when you got old, you gave away the money. And then they celebrated you for being a philanthropist. And he was furious that the media had supposedly broken this deal that never existed and was always a lie. And how much of his sort of reactionary stance today is a result of like the media criticizing him at one point. And it was such a eye-openingly bizarre situation where like he seemed to think that he was owed praise from the media. And the second the media took a critical look at things that he did, and admittedly, some of it was unfair. Absolutely. And I've called out unfair journalism over and over again because I think a lot of it is unfair. But to completely like blow up democracy because of that and to embrace sort of fascism seems bad. Yeah.
And it's I'm putting that at your door now that I know that you had the chance to change the course of history back in 1993 or whatever it was.
But I do think it is a notable moment in sort of showing how much the position of the media coverage impacted some of the people who were building these technologies and how absolutely offended they were that they didn't get universal praise and adoration from the media. And you can argue that both sides of that equation went too far. Like the praise and adoration was maybe too much and the backlash was probably too much and, lost nuance and missed things. But like to then reorient your worldview that the most evil thing in the world is the media, I think is also a huge mistake and really problematic and leads to a lot of the problems that we're in, where Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel have all decided that the media is so evil and must be destroyed, that has completely reoriented their worldview and taken it away from like what these technologies were actually supposed to be enabling, which was, more speech, which should mean more press, which was that sort of early story that we were talking about in the earlier eras. And so it is sort of weird how like enabling the media to do more then caused them to flip out. And they now frame it as in like, oh, but we're enabling like individuals to be the media to replace the evil mainstream media or whatever. But like, it's always nonsense. It's always wanting people to praise them and wanting to punish those who didn't.
Yeah, and I think that is the way the media should work, right? It's kind of how it's designed. It's just that some of these billionaires haven't been told that, and that's really the kind of point of the paper. I think is to show that there is this relationship between media coverage and the way that platforms work in lots of different ways. It's not kind of like for like. It's not necessarily kind of causal, but I think that good coverage, good nuanced coverage of what platforms are doing broadly, but also in regards to user safety, is important. And that's to bring it back to kind of what we do every week.
Yeah.
That's what's important about Ctrl-Alt-Speech and about Tay-Tay and about everything in moderation as well, is that you need to be able to dish out criticism or critique or analysis when it merits it, but you also need to reflect the fact that this is a very difficult industry to be in, particularly if you're in trust and safety. These are not easily solved challenges, particularly at the scale that these platforms work. And I think we do a fairly good job, at least our listeners tell us, Mike, that we do a fairly good job of reflecting.
Speaking of which, review the podcast.
Yeah, review the podcast. So I think that kind of, if I just want to kind of sum up, I guess, what the paper is designed to do and how that reflects in our work, I think that would be the takeaways, that good nuanced media coverage of what platforms are doing matters. And yes, more media, I think, could do that. We're not perfect either, and we're constantly trying to improve. So do rate and review us if you like the work we do. Do sponsor the podcast if you're an organization or an institution that wants to reach important decision makers in the tech industry. And keep listening, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think the important thing here, the real point, is that this is an ecosystem and that the internet and the media ecosystem impact each other. And having a good understanding and a thoughtful understanding of what is happening and how these things work together is really important. And we go through phases, and sometimes they're better than others, and sometimes they're more nuanced than others, and sometimes they're simplistic. And what we're really trying to do here is to cover that and that intersection of media and internet and innovation in a way that leads to better understanding and a real understanding of like the challenges and the safety questions that come up in all of this. And I think understanding that history that you laid out in this paper is really, really important.
Yeah. And that's a good point to kind of wrap up today, Mike. Great to be able to kind of talk off script in a way that is different to our usual episodes. I hope our listeners get a chance to have a read of the paper. We'd love to hear people's thoughts. podcast@Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. And keep listening. Thanks for taking part today, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com.